Good to have you with us in the 9 p.m. edition of the Urban Debate, and we continue with our special focus on the Afghan turmoil and the takeover by Taliban. The first 1 hour, we spoke about the people there. We spoke to their family members here in India who told us stories of horror of what's going on in Afghanistan, the sheer fear and panic that has spread across the country. We also spoke about specifically India and what it means, this Taliban takeover, what does it mean for India and our future. Now I want to talk about the world, India and rest of the world. We seem to have abandoned the people of Afghanistan. The world powers definitely have. Not just that, they're actually now only sending in their troops to bring out their own people. And maybe some of the Afghan nationals who would have helped their own people and their forces. So thousands of soldiers from UK and US are actually there. Even Germany is sending its people to evacuate their own. While it's the Afghan nationals who don't know where to go, who don't know where to run. Nobody's even talking about the girls, the women. They're not even anywhere to be seen. They're not even attempting to run. They're not even attempting to escape, perhaps because they're so scared to get out of their homes. And so what you see on your screens is the reality of the Kabul airport, is the reality of Afghanistan today. Well, what is it that the rest of the world is doing? Germany is planning to deploy soldiers in Afghanistan to assist evacuation of Germans and few Afghans that they may give refuge to. They have said that human rights activists will be prioritized. United States, the one who actually started this with their peace pact in February 2020 with Taliban, has sent in troops now. They withdrew troops from Afghanistan, then they sent in troops to get their own people out of that country. We're going to talk about their strategy and how that may have been the biggest mistake that the world will pay for. United Kingdom, though, has been slightly more vocal about this and actually said that the decision of United States to pull out troops has accelerated things. They've also said that everybody should prematurely recognize a new government. Not that anybody is listening. Countries like Russia and China are going to do what they want any which ways. But UK wants countries to wait and watch to see how Taliban behaves. Pakistan's very clear. They use a lot of international diplomatic jargon, but they're not averse to Taliban. How can they be? They're the backers of Taliban. Very glad that people have been freed from the shackles of slavery in Afghanistan. Russia says no plans to evacuate the embassy. They, in fact, are already looking at holding dialogues. They've said the Taliban has promised us safety of our embassies in Kabul, and that Taliban has good relations with Russia. They will recognize their government based on their conduct. So this is how the world is responding. Each looking out, each nation looking out for themselves. Each nation looking out for their equations with other big superpowers. Nobody really planning any big way to help the people of Afghanistan. Sure, some will be given refuge. India will be hopefully one of them that does give refuge at some point. We haven't yet spoken about it. Our priority also right now is to evacuate our people, some of the Indian nationals who are still there. We're also in touch with the Afghan Sikh and Hindu communities there, and the government has said when flights resume, we will repatriate whoever wants to. Let's talk about what's going on and how the world is handling it, and if that's the right way to go forward. David Loyne, former media advisor to Afghan president, joins me this evening. Ambassador Ashraf Heidari, ambassador of Afghanistan to Sri Lanka, also with me this evening. Mark Sleboda, international relation analyst, joining us from Moscow. Professor Asif Ramiz Daudi, former chairman of the managing committee of International Indian School at Jeddah. Maid Ali, senior journalist in Pakistan, with me this evening as well. Thank you so much to all of you for being with us this evening. Let me actually start off with David Loyne. David, we've just seen commentary coming from from the UN Security Council, various countries making their remarks. But is it really of any impact, of any consequences, what the countries say there versus what happens in real?
It's going to be very difficult for the outside world to know how to react to this. It's all happened so quickly. I think any of us who have been looking at Afghanistan in detail for a while, all of us are completely shocked. I was on radio and television in Britain 10 days ago saying, that Afghan special forces would hold the cities. But it turned out that the Afghan forces were really hollow at the end, and the momentum of the war, once the Taliban had taken the countryside and moved so quickly across the cities, meant that more and more collapsed ahead of them. There's a military saying that rivers flow fastest towards the end, and we've certainly seen that in Afghanistan as things accelerated in the last few days. And given the extraordinary chaos at the airport of thousands of people sort of running to try and jump onto planes and falling off them out of the sky as the planes take off, it's very difficult to see how the international community can do more than this emergency evacuation of their own passport holders and people who support them, and then begin to look at humanitarian support and humanitarian aid. I think going forward, there are big questions over recognition of the Taliban government, the Taliban administration in Afghanistan, and there are big questions over development aid and what kind of development and infrastructure aid the international community, donor community, will be offering. And of course, India is left with a very significant foreign policy setback. India has been such a generous donor to Afghanistan over the years. I was in the Afghan parliament building. I remember Sikh foremen working with Afghan builders to put that building up, all with Indian money, the huge investments that India's put in. And all of that is now very much at jeopardy as Pakistan has, and China in a sense, have so significantly increased their footprint in the region with this Taliban takeover.
Oh, yes, absolutely. One would have never hoped to see the regressive militant organization Taliban, inside that parliament that we built and worked towards. But let me ask Ambassador Ashraf Haidery, what is it, Ambassador, realistically speaking, that Afghanistan can get from the world right now?
Well, first of all, I agree partially with what the other speaker said, but I also disagree. Let's remember that the Afghan people and our forces have been experiencing what has been going on effectively from 2003 onwards, and then we took over the protection of our population from the NATO at the end of 2014, and since we have been fighting and dying. If you look at the statistics, both look at the UNAMA reports, thousands of Afghans dying a year, and as well as multiple times more our forces. And also let's remember that the announcement to abruptly withdraw all the key enablers were made, I think, sometime in April and May, since when our forces have been fighting, and as well as resistance fighters that joined them in some of the areas. They put up really good resistance. But unfortunately, what happened is this, unfortunately, demoralization over time of our people and our forces, as they realized that the international community, one by one, had been tweeting one by one, talking about evacuations after evacuations and after evacuations, pretty much, telling us that we're not going to provide you with the enablers that you need, up until, a few days ago, that when, airstrikes actually resumed in support of our forces, and by then it was too late. So that said, I think our focus now should be on providing humanitarian assistance. And even here, I remember the United Nations launched this humanitarian appeal for $1.3 billion, of which about 30% or so has been met. And this is another, unfortunately, betrayal of the Afghan people from our very partners, which we know under the 3-4 administrations of the U.S. and as well as other allies of the U.S. Have happened and evolved. So this is not something that has happened just in the past 2 months. This has been happening at least for the past 2 years, when the Trump administration cut this deal without really getting anything from the Taliban, while making us, release 6,000 Taliban, fighters, most of whom ended up in the battlefield. That's another factor that no one really talks about, which we had to release them and then fight them in the battlefield, unfortunately, while doing nothing to bring the pressures that the international community should have and still should on the state sponsor of the Taliban to really deliver on their commitments. And that includes the UK, which we've been, expecting to have done. But unfortunately, all we have gotten from all our partners have been more talk, and there is much consensus, there's much commitment, as you just heard, even in today's emergency session on Afghanistan at the United Nations. But only if those words had actually been acted upon, only if our partners had actually, walked the talk. And that includes our neighborhood. Let's remember, most of our neighbors have been complaining about the presence of NATO in Afghanistan. And I've been telling them that now NATO has withdrawn. There is a vacuum. It's an opportunity for SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, to fill this vacuum. But where are they? We don't see them. There in every meeting and every talk show and every meeting that has taken place in Doha for the past 2 years, making the right statements, including the recent Troika Plus that took place in Doha. But unfortunately, when it comes to tangible action in support of the Afghan people, in support of making sure that this transition now happens, with a focus on humanitarian assistance and meeting this appeal launched by the UN, unfortunately, it is still talk. And let's see, moving forward from today's emergency session of Afghanistan, what the world would do, how they would work with the key stakeholders, those with leverage on the Taliban to make sure that this is going to happen orderly without any damage to our infrastructure, and as well as ensuring the safety and security of every Afghan citizen, whether they have worked with the government or have not.
Mr. Hedri, before I move on, very quickly, because you mentioned about how the air support from your allies and nations came in very late. By then, it was too late. But how is that? On one hand, the government was being asked to release Taliban prisoners and holding up on that end of the bargain, but didn't know what that would lead to. And it was only after they had pretty much taken control of everything that the countries realized that perhaps they need to help the government out.
Exactly. This irresponsible decision by the Biden administration against the advice of its own military advisors who had advised them to leave behind this 2,000 plus residual force in Afghanistan with those enablers, including logistics, maintenance, and as well as close air support that we had needed, but also to push really diplomatically to make the peace process succeed. Because remember, the process was very much based on coercive mediation carried out by the special envoy to Afghanistan, Zalmay Khalilzad, which unfortunately tilted the balance of power in favor of the Taliban for the past 2 years, and also bought them so much time to prepare for larger scale attacks and offensives as it materialized, because they've been waiting for the withdrawal, for the announcement of the withdrawal, because they've been told and expecting it. All these things had been discussed with them, and as a result, they promised, they didn't deliver. While the U.S. was really intent on doing it, and the Taliban, their state sponsor, knew that was going to happen. We were coerced into releasing 6,000 prisoners, most of whom ended up on the battlefield. One of the commitments also was to prevent them from returning to the battlefield. Another was to cut ties with Al-Qaeda, which is not happened. Unfortunately, all of these compounded and resulted into demoralization of the Afghan people and their forces, that they saw everyone is giving up, and that their lives were put into danger, and they also slowly but surely gave up.
Correct. No, you're absolutely right, and very insightful what you're saying here. And unfortunate, of course, goes without saying. Mr. Mark Sloboda, good evening to you. In some sense, then, can we say that Biden administration's series of decisions effectively handed over everything on a platter to Taliban?
Well, speaking as a U.S. military veteran myself and a security analyst, I have to say that the decision of the Biden administration to withdraw its occupation force from Afghanistan was the correct decision. for the American people and in the end for the Afghanistan people as well. We have seen a 20-year military occupation and nation building effort that cost the US taxpayers $3.2 trillion failed ultimately because of its hegemonic hubris, the belief that they could refashion the Afghan people into something that looked like themselves in an attempt then to create some type of domino effect that would change the Islamic world and Eurasia itself. It was a supreme act of hubris. It has cost an enormous amount of American, Afghan, NATO lives and money in the process. And what has resulted from it? Nothing. Nothing. Actually, the Taliban is now in greater control of Afghanistan territorially and strength-wise than they were before the 2001 U.S. invasion, because they never controlled the north. Now they control all the country, and all indications are that a Taliban 2.0 is a much more politically savvy and PR savvy regime than they were before. They have made outreach to a lot of the warlords, to some members of the previous U.S. client regime, and they seem to be trying to form a somewhat more inclusive leadership of the country than they did before. Afghanistan has been in civil conflict for over 40 years.
Correct.
Now, despite the fact that it's ending, unfortunately, with a Wahhabist, rulership over the country, there is at last a chance for real peace, and a lot of that depends on how the new regime reaches out to minority, ethnic, and religious groups within the country, but also how it deals with outside powers.
Mr.
Does
Sleboda, I may
turn to terrorism?
Right.
Does it seek to export its Wahhabi ideology to other countries? Or is it looking inwardly to rebuild and fashion their own nation finally?
Well, based on their ideologies and their fundamental thought process, I don't think that is going to happen. I know you say that this process and 40 years of conflict has ended now, but I don't think it's ended. Not for the people of Afghanistan, definitely not for the women and girls of Afghanistan, definitely not for the terror factories that already exist in its neighboring state, and they're such good friends with Pakistan. When all of that moves there, I don't think this will be an end of any conflict related to Afghanistan or Taliban. But let me just point this out. Fair, I agree that this was a good decision as far as the people of America is concerned, in the interest of the soldiers and the army of America. All right, good decision to pull out. But take a look at what we've been told. And as late as July, we were told that the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan is not inevitable. It's not for sure that this will happen. We were told that the Afghan troops are well equipped and a well-equipped army in this world, and they can take it on. We were also told that the Air Force itself in Afghanistan can take on the Taliban very easily, along with the air support that they have. But what has happened? Within weeks, the entire country has crumbled. The military of Afghanistan really couldn't put up a fight, is nowhere to be seen, or did not stand a chance in front of these Talibani forces. And everybody else seems to have abandoned them as well. So, David Loyne, should we not be asking these questions to United States of America? Did their intel not fail, or did they really not care and that kept giving these assurances?
If I could go back to something that Mark said, he says that there might be peace in Afghanistan, but, it's going to be peace at a very high price for the Afghan people, and at a very high price, actually, for the successes that he and other, US soldiers and international soldiers fought for in the last 20 years, because it wasn't all wasted. I mean, Osama bin Laden was finally tracked down to Abbottabad and killed, and Al-Qaeda was significantly weakened over those years. But more importantly, there was the beginnings of a country that wasn't going to be a crucible for terrorism again. And the administration of President Ghani that Ambassador Haidari served was, for all its faults, significantly creating an opportunity for a new generation. And Afghanistan's population is extraordinarily young. And many of those people, I was there for the election in 2019, and I saw young women voting who weren't born at the time of 9/11. Their entire lives, their education, their opportunities were, in a sense, in Western hands. And it only took, 2,500, 2,500 American troops on the ground with another 7,000 or 8,000 in other international troops to hold the line against the Taliban. The Italians, Germans, Turks, and British troops in particular who were with Americans. And that was the recommendation, you all know, that the military chiefs made to President Biden, as they'd made to President Trump before him. And I've got a book coming out next month called The Long War, which talks about the American war in Afghanistan in detail. And I did a lot of research around the Obama White House in 2009, the key year when the surge was decided, when Stan McChrystal came in, and there were these long arguments about how many troops to put in and whether it was worth putting in more troops for one last chance to do the job in Afghanistan. And during those discussions, the strongest voice in the Obama White House against putting troops in and pulling it down to a minimum of 1,000 was Vice President Joe Biden. And he was very strong at the time in that sense. And coming in at the beginning of this year, he didn't want people like General Joe Dunford, who made a very strong recommendation, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, to keep troops in for the foreseeable future, as America has troops in 140 countries in the world. But he wanted to pull them out. And the way that they've been pulled out has, I think, really weakened the United States and weakened actually the Western enterprise, if you like, that the United States is at the front of in the world in particular. So we're looking at countries like China, Russia, Pakistan, now significantly strengthened, and America's other allies in the world wondering whether they can now trust the United States. And when President Biden was elected, he came in and said, America is back. Well, internationally, with this disaster, really, Saigon on steroids, what we're seeing in Kabul at the moment, I think a lot of people will be questioning whether that can be true.
Mark, would you want to respond to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we have seen 20 years of U.S. military occupation. We have seen surges of up to 100,000 U.S. troops at a time. And despite their best efforts, they could not change the Afghan people. And when we speak of the Afghan people, we have to be very careful because, there's a very big tendency in the media to put on the screen a minority of the Afghan population that were assisting the U.S. military occupation and whose values appealed to them. But at the end of the day, there was a 307,000 strong Afghan national security force against an estimated 50,000 Taliban fighters. They had better salaries, they had better money resources, they had far better weapons, they had an air force. And at the end of the day, the Afghan National Security Forces refused to fight. Why did they refuse to fight? Because the government that was installed over them by the United States, they did not feel it was their own government. It was incredibly corrupt. It did not represent the majority of the Afghan people's values or cultures. And that's why, in the end, they surrendered, they ran away, they went over to the Taliban, or they simply went home, because none of them felt that that regime in Kabul was worth dying for. Mm-hmm. And that's the end truth of it.
No, that is fine. I agree with you. I think it would be very difficult, though United States does it repeatedly, but it would be difficult for any country to justify to their own people why their citizens are going to a third foreign land and losing lives or dying out there. But yes, Ambassador Haidari, you wanted to come in. Go ahead, please.
I think we're just barking at the wrong tree. We completely disagree. We are talking about 50,000 plus and 70,000 plus. No, my friend, There have been safe sanctuaries for the past 40 years. Now we know the history of the 20 years before the latest 20 years, and then we know the thousands of madrasas. We know that tens of these other terrorist outfits, well trained, well equipped, and with the backing of a whole state infrastructure that you really don't talk about. Please talk about the elephant in the room. Our forces, you can go and count online right now, and I can send you, if you send me your email, the hundreds of thousands of the Taliban fighters that they have killed. Of course, they've also been killed because that's a war. They have won battles. They have won the battles. You should admit that the international community, the United States, has not won the war, and the war, unfortunately, cannot, will not, and has not been won in Afghanistan simply because it's the wrong war and the wrong enemy in the wrong place. That's why the former president, Karzai, for a long time had been talking about, fighting the wrong war in the Afghan villages and in the Afghan mountains. Well, no insurgency. The Iran Corporation has done a study of 400 insurgencies, and their, principal finding is that no insurgency without, external support can survive. And that's exactly what happened. My friend, let's just not be blind and blame it on the Afghan people. The Afghan people, just like you and your kids and your family, would, just like also David pointed out, from across the country, would like to modernize, would like to move on, would like to have a peaceful, basic, normal life so their kids go to school, the university, and then have a secure future. Afghans are egalitarian. Don't forget, you don't know Afghanistan. You've never been to Afghanistan, probably. Mountainous people, much like the Swiss, are centrifugal. They're egalitarian. They demand democracy. That's why we have embraced democracy. I don't rule out, corruption. I don't rule out weak governance. I don't rule out, weaknesses across the state in Afghanistan. But remember that this has been a very young 20-year-old state that we have, all of us have been involved in building, because the state had completely evaporated. And in the wake of 9/11, there was no stateness. We had a strong nation of 5,000 years history. We were not born yesterday, but yes, unfortunately, we have lacked a state, and we don't have a state as we speak now, because much of the state institutions that we had built, the Taliban, with the support of their state sponsor, have destroyed them, including the connectivity infrastructure internally as well as externally. We have too many achievements, too much progress, thousands and thousands and thousands of Afghan lives, because I lived in Afghanistan and I know for the past 45 years of my life, my friend. Let's not just sit back in a chair and blame it all on the Afghan people, because this has not been.
Mr. Hadri, I think your sentiment is very understandable.
And global enterprise. We all have failed. Afghans have done the lion's share of the fighting and the dying, and we see, as you see, it's happening even today as you're all evacuating from Kabul.
Mr. Hadri, your anger is completely understandable and justified. We were speaking to some of the Afghan nationals, youngsters who are in India currently, their families back home, and the stories that they've already begun to narrate, fear, panic, running away, homeless, don't know where to get, a safe haven. But let me ask you this question. If the so-called peace pact was signed with Taliban in February 2020, for 1.5 years, why have many other corners of the world been silent about it? Did the world at that point really believe Taliban could turn the corner?
Well, everyone has just basically accepted and just believed. Well, the reality was that they were not cooperating. The reality was that they were just buying time, because simply it was a non-policy to withdraw under the Trump administration, and then the Biden administration said, well, since they had signed this, we need to really implement it, and that's because that's been their policy, to simply withdraw without. Actually, we know from conflict resolution and international peacemaking experiences that unless you negotiate from a position of strength, especially where the insurgency or whatever you call it as an external supporter, supplying with full spectrum aid, it's not going to produce the results that you expect at the table. And that's what exactly happened. We were deceived. and unfortunately, and coerced, even in making an unprecedented concession. It hasn't happened in the recent history of peacemaking. No country, unfortunately, warring party released 6,000 notorious, dangerous, lethal terrorists and drug traffickers, which was, unfortunately imposed on us to do for the sake of peace, which we did. That's why we had to hold that lawyer jirga so that we get the consent of the Afghan people to do that, because simply our conscience would not have allowed us to do that. There was so much resistance internally for not to happen, but simply because Donald Trump had made up his mind. And then, of course, we had to do that. And then, again, the incoming administration had made up its mind, and it was just discussed. And that's exactly what happened. And the Afghan people, unfortunately, were let down in every way. The Afghan and Afghan people, and you see the scenes on the tarmac of the airport, and their desperation and their fear of what's going to come, because no one is sure what is going to come, because they've been let down and betrayed and betrayed and betrayed, unfortunately.
Yes, and as much of the PR machinery...
It wasn't a peace deal. It wasn't a peace deal. It was a withdrawal deal. It was really, really deeply flawed. President Trump insisted on wanting to get American troops out, and so he insisted then that there were two things that the Taliban wanted. They wanted their prisoners out of jail, and they wanted American troops out of Afghanistan, American and other international troops. And they got both of those things out of the Doha agreement. And the Afghan administration got nothing in return except for a vague promise of talks by the Taliban. The flaw at the heart of that deal, and the big mistake, as Ambassador Haidari again says, that you need to negotiate from a position of strength. Back in 2017-18, America had a position of strength. The Taliban were losing a lot of people because America had a very significant bombing campaign at that time. And that was one of the things that brought them to the negotiating table. But what they got was everything that they wanted. And at the heart of the deal, there should have been an insistence on a ceasefire. If you're going to release prisoners, only after a ceasefire, or graduated against the strength of that ceasefire. And the ceasefire was written in very vague terms in the peace deal, but the prisoner release was written really specifically, and the troop withdrawal was written really specifically. So the Taliban got everything they wanted out of the United States, and we're now seeing the consequences in this chaos. And Afghanistan falling into the hands of a narco state, a criminal enterprise, really, of an organization that is financed by drugs and extortion on the roads, and very significant sort of lack of capacity to govern any sort of modern country of the sort that Afghanistan has become. And that's what's the consequence of this very swift withdrawal. And
countries, states very quickly lining up to back this kind of a regime is what makes it even more sad. Such is the nature of politics in the world. Thank you so much to all three of you for joining me on this conversation with your insights. And we continue, and we go ahead and say good evening to more panelists, experts in this sphere who are joining me right now. Professor Asif Ramiz Daudi, former chairman of the Managing Committee of International Indian School in Jeddah. Maid Ali, senior journalist from Pakistan. And I also have Maruf Raza, strategic affairs expert, here joining us right now. Maruf, I want to start off with you. And, we were just talking about the February 2020 pact that was made. Even if it was the Trump administration at that time that, agreed upon it, did the Biden administration have to go ahead with it and handle it the way they did? And if situation on ground wasn't looking stable enough, did they have to fully exit in such a manner?
Not really. I mean, any professional will tell you that in any professional engagement, you have a handing taking over policy. You hand over some information, you hand over resources to the incoming successor. Now, the Biden administration on one side is blaming the Trump administration for giving this chaos to them to implement. On the other hand, they knew what they were up against. It is not that American intelligence agencies don't pass on information to the next administration. Everything was available. You've been in that country for 20 years and you did not read the writing on the wall with what the Taliban was waiting to do. I remember reading a cover in an international magazine, a cover story, at least 10 years ago, where there was a Taliban fighter on the cover and said, the Americans will go one day, we are going to be here and we are going to stay. So there was a complete finality to the Taliban's idea that they are going to get back in the saddle. And having said that, there are three things that strike out about the American withdrawal. One is a complete failure of American intelligence. Two, the withdrawal, and especially the disgraceful exit from Bagram, left the entire edifice in shambles. So not only did America left 3.5 million pieces of all sorts of equipment, from phones and walkie-talkies to military systems, but they just packed their bags and ran away in the darkness of one night. The third thing that strikes out is the Americans trained the Afghan army, but for a variety of reasons, weren't able to understand that at the end of the day, the Afghan army, the Afghans have a tradition of switching loyalties. They are going to buckle down very easily. If the Americans show such haste in getting out, why should the Afghan army and their ANA soldiers stick their neck on the line, especially when they have to live in Afghanistan with their family? It was almost an inevitability that they were up against. Secondly, the fact that Pakistan has been the father of the Taliban cannot be denied, whatever denials you will get, but there is enough documented evidence. I'm not just talking of Western writers, but I'm also talking of Pakistani writers who have articulated this in great detail. The Pakistani role in Afghanistan and in controlling the Taliban was based on a strategic plot that Pakistan wanted eventually to be the guiding force of the Taliban regime. If there are Taliban elements who are not totally beholden to Pakistan, they don't completely buckle down under Pakistani influence and pressure. But the fact that even General Petraeus, who was the earlier US and NATO forces commander in Afghanistan, has clearly stated that Taliban's home was really in Pakistan. The Quetta Shura is a case in point. Peshawar is a case in point. Every Pakistani knows that the Taliban, really their family and their medical systems and support systems came out of Pakistan's, the AFPAC region. Now, what Pakistan intends to do with the Taliban, I personally believe that they will this time adopt a modified approach to what was the approach in 96-2001 when the Taliban was there in control. So, because they have to be more internationally acceptable, the Taliban leadership has got exposed, has got sanctified by engaging with them in Doha and other talks. So they understand the game to some extent of what the world wants, but don't go by any assurances that the Taliban will give you, because they are known to reverse their stand very quickly.
Right.
Depending on, as Ambassador Hydari was bringing out, can you negotiate with them from a position of peace?
Right.
From a position of strength, sorry. Can you negotiate for peace from a position of strength? And finally, who is going to give support to Pakistan financially and otherwise to implement this larger game plan? It is China. China is looking at the resources there. China is looking to extend its Belt and Road Initiative there. And Pakistan sees Afghanistan as a resource-rich region where they get a lot of dry fruits from, but more importantly, the opium trade comes from there. I am not saying it. People like Aisha Siddiqa, again a Pakistani expert on Pakistan's military, has said that the Pakistani military gets up to $19 billion upwards each year with the drug trade. Now Pakistan will control it even more because now it's completely under their umbrella.
Yes.
And finally, what is China going to do? This is what Pakistan has been waiting for. To play the game in Afghanistan, this time as China's lackey. Last time they were America's lackey. The fact that Pakistan will keep it under its control is Pakistan's biggest negotiating leverage in this part of the world. What India can expect, I mean, we can really just wait and watch because we don't have land contiguity with them. And that's why I argue that we don't have the kind of threat from a spillover effect of whatever the Taliban does in Afghanistan on Indian soil. Pakistan has created this Frankenstein monster. They are going to have the spillover effect of refugees, if at all.
Okay, but Maruf, you know what you've said, I want to go back to the larger context of how various countries have reacted and what happens next. And you've mentioned Pakistan. Pakistani Prime Minister has been quoted as saying that, well, this is a sign of breaking the chains of slavery. I don't think there was any doubt of what Pakistan's stand, official or unofficial, whichever way will be. But there is also now the support of China. On the other side, there is also Russia that's already looking at working and talking and holding dialogues with Taliban. In such a scenario, Professor Dowdy, how does the West believe that this is a sensible move to get out of there, look the other way, just evacuate your own people, and Afghanistan will never be a challenge anymore?
Tanvi, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. After the sudden and rapid developments in Afghanistan, especially since yesterday, the entire world is reacting and showing their concerns. Like here, how West is, thinking on all these developments. That's a big question. But another one, what you said, whether it's a smooth transition or not, where I have to say, like the desperate crowd and heartbreaking visuals coming from Kabul airport, where thousands of Afghans, they are trying to flee from their own country, and how they are running, falling down from the airplane and losing their own lives. These are like clear-cut indication that it's not a kind of a smooth transition, and there should be something, the safety of the local Afghans should be guaranteed, and some sort of.
Right, but the point being, Professor Dowdy, who's going to do that? I mean, guarantees and Taliban don't really go together.
That's a very good question, and that's a very big question, that who is accountable for that, and who is going to fix all these problems? And that's a big question. But here now, the local people, they have no options left with them. They can't be the choosers here in this situation. And our heart goes to the families there who are actually facing the situation and the problems there. Now, who is going to take the responsibility? That's a big question. Now here, it could be either America. America was there for around 2 decades trying to, maintain the democratical setup there, helping the Ghani government and setting, the army there. But here, America can be responsible for this. Many experts are saying, and the things that are happening here, it gives the indication that somehow or the other, there is a doubt that, it leaves a kind of message that it could have been easily, managed well. And another one here, the Pakistan is there, and today
yes, Professor Dowdy, since you've raised that point, I want to actually bring in Mr. Maid Ali, senior journalist from Pakistan. Mr. Maid Ali, it's been a while since we spoke, but thank you for joining us. Give us insights on, how the Pakistani establishment and various stakeholders there are viewing what happens next and what role Pakistan will have to play there.
We have a mixed reaction, I think, in Pakistan. As far as the establishment is concerned, they are trying to handle the situation at hand, which was not sort of thinkable, say, a few weeks back, that Taliban would take Kabul like that. So we're thinking about it, and we are watching everything with our fingers crossed. Though there's a segment in the establishment which believes that Taliban might be suitable for Pakistan in future, but the doubt is there because we've had a very terrible backlash of the previous Taliban activities in Afghanistan, and that spilled over to Pakistan in the shape of Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan. So, and we are pretty sure here in Pakistan, everybody, including the government and the establishment and the people, that the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan has a deep and deep-rooted relationship, ethnic sort of brotherhood and relationship with the Taliban in Afghanistan, and the way Taliban have conquered Kabul, I think it's a bad omen.
Mr. Mayad Ali, there seems to be some attempt by the Taliban of 2021, to use the same platforms that several other entities use for good PR and political, messaging, and they seem to be doing that. Putting out videos of the kind of opulence that the Afghani politicians really enjoyed, putting out messages of how they are for peace, going even into media houses, taking away the guns, but saying that we will keep you safe and you are protected and continue to do your work. What do we know outside of all of this grandstanding and messaging? What do we know of this Taliban? Is it the same? Is it worse? Is it better?
You see, in my opinion, as far as their ideology is concerned, they're the same. And that ideology is shared by not only Taliban, but other sort of tags like Daesh and ICS and everybody who's got sort of this idea, this notion of Islam that Taliban share. As far as these things are concerned, that they are very civilized and they would spare the people and they will sort of they wouldn't want bloodshed. I think these are all optics just to measure the response of the world to get some support from the outside world, and I think the U.S. has done. Again, they are very good at doing such things, leaving countries totally disarrayed, leaving the region in turmoil. Everybody's worried in the region. If India thinks that Pakistan is okay with whatever is going on, no. Pakistan is also worried, and Pakistan will have to sort of move on the tightrope as far as their relationship with Taliban is concerned. These are just optics, Once they would settle down, then we'll have to see whether they have groomed over the years a little bit. You see, the governments are not run by people such as they have already in their ranks and file. Governments are run by people who know how to run the government. And Taliban, and secondly, once the power is there, I'm pretty sure there'll be a tussle for power amongst the groups within the Taliban. And that is what is very, very, very dangerous. And I am quite apprehensive of this fact.
Okay, yes, no, you're fair enough. What you're saying is absolutely right. In fact, I just want to read out what the UN Secretary General said just a short while ago. Fear a return of darkest days for Afghanistan, must speak with one voice to uphold human rights. I think, Maruf, you and I will all be on the same page to say all of this commentary at UNSC is not going to help the people of Afghanistan at all. But what next? Is there anything?
I've always maintained that, we give too much importance to the UN. It is really a toothless organization. And I've often said it is the world's most overrated debating society. They make these statements and they want everyone to take it seriously. And I'm surprised how much value are people in South Bloc attached to the UN, when India should have been in the Security Council from the 1950s when it was first suggested by the US. Pandit Nehru, in all his wisdom, abandoned that position and gave it to China. And since then, we've been sitting in the same ranks with countries like Fiji Islands and Seychelles. But anyway, I have my own issues with the UN and I don't give it much importance. What is more important is for us to understand what we can do in the current circumstances. We are currently the rotating president of the UN Security Council. But again, we'll make a few statements, they'll get filed, and we'll feel happy that it was recorded. In the current situation, I respect the distinguished Pakistani journalist,
Yes.
and who has made some very honest points. And, it's very rare. I'm on a debate with a Pakistani journalist who I can salute with respect and say, sir, you have spoken the truth as a true journalist, and I wish there are more like you. The other person I respect in your country is Ahmed Rashid, who's the author of Descent into Chaos and other books. But let me get to the point here. I think there are 3 or 4 issues that we need to understand the big picture. What is it that the Taliban has been sent in to do? Certainly they will do optics. Certainly they are better trained this time to handle any possible fallout of their medieval behavior. But more important for them is to try and push the agenda for having an Islamic emirate of sorts, whether it stretches from Afghanistan northwards into Central Asia, whether it remains confined in Afghanistan. But Pakistan has been longing to do this ever since General Mirza Aslam Beg, the army chief of Pakistan after General Zia, adopted the concept of strategic depth. Now, when you play with fire, you burn your hands. So Pakistan will have a problem. They had a major refugee problem after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. They have lived with it. Robert Wersing talks about it in his book in great detail. But subsequently also, Pakistan has been engaging with 2 types of Taliban. One is the pro-Pakistan Taliban, and one, as Mahid Saab brought out, is the one which you really cannot predict, because they are trying to see where they can get their toast buttered better.
Yes.
And that is the Taliban that is going to cause a certain degree of concern. But I don't know how much concern the international community is going to have now that they have exited and washed their hands of Afghanistan. It has been a reflection of a larger point for India. We need to go back and think about it, that if America could abandon a land where they had reasonable control over, they had invested 20 years of their time, they had invested $1.3 trillion and 3,000 dead soldiers and many more wounded. What is it that you can expect from America in this Indo-US strategic partnership? Please understand, when the chips are down, and if America doesn't see benefits coming to itself, it'll abandon you. I've told Pakistani strategic experts in the past that you have cuddled up to America at least 3 times in your history, and on 3 occasions you've been abandoned. I was told by General Musharraf in my interview with him that he said we had no choice. We had to abandon the Taliban because the Americans told us, you do that, otherwise we'll bomb you to Stone Age. You know, Musharraf,
Yes.
between 1998 and 2001, provided more troops, more ammunition, and firepower to the Taliban on the ground before the Americans came in 2001 than anybody else did. And this was to use the Taliban to stretch Pakistan's goal from the Indus to the Oxus.
Right.
The Oxus River lies in Central Asia. An academic once wrote a book about that. But the fact is, the Taliban sees part of Pakistan territory as part of their strategic goal. The Taliban's made up of Pakhtuns. The Pakhtuns are on both sides of the Durand Line. The Durand Line was an artificial line that was put together by the British, by the same guy who made the McMahon Line, which is the Sino-Indian boundary in Arunachal, Henry McMahon. And the Durand Line is not recognized by the Pashtuns, and the Taliban make up the Pashtuns. So Pakistan should be alert that the Taliban may be just gunning for the west banks of the Indus, which is a lot of Pakistani territory.
Yeah.
So,
Maruf, effectively you're also saying that while Pakistan may be, celebrating today, or the Pakistani government seems to be feeling like they're in a sweet spot today, it may become a challenge for them as well, because, well, at the end of the day, this is Taliban. We'll wait and watch what happens. I am completely out of time. So thank you to both Mahid Ali and Maruf Raza for joining me on this conversation. fact of the matter is, viewers, the world has abandoned the people of Afghanistan. Countries may have invaded them over the last 4 decades for their own personal and selfish motives, completely torn apart, destroyed that country, claimed to have built that country, and then exited that country. And yet again, it seems as if Afghanistan is going to go into dark ages. Words of the United Nations General Secretary himself. And nobody at this point is going to be stopping Taliban. Not right now. All we can do is hope that countries continue to provide aid, continue to at least speak about human rights, speak about protection of people, protection of the Afghan civilians, and wherever possible, give asylum to the refugees. That is as much as we can do at this point. Perhaps at a later point, somebody will turn around and make such regimes accountable. Thank you for joining us.